Okay, hello guys. Today is the 4th of June 2017. Okay, my name is Yuri, as some of you might actually still remember. I'm going live today and I'm gonna be talking about the subject I didn't really want to talk about for a while. Simply, I have too many friends from Russia and Ukraine, and me being from Ukraine and things like this, but it's kind of, and recently I've been asked a question about this, and I understand that so many people still don't understand what goes on in the east of Europe. So today I'm actually going to talk about the Russian invasion into Ukraine, and I'm not going to talk just the present day, because far too many people do not understand the reasons for that to happen. They don't understand, why would the Russians want to invade the Ukraine. And why would they be so insistent at not letting Ukraine become its own country in a way? So there's a long history behind that, and obviously, it's kind of just a second. Okay, sorry. It's kind of obviously going to be it's very long to go to all the details of the situation. Obviously, the history is, well, it's around 1500 years worth of history in that situation. So, so obviously, we're not going to be able to cover the whole of it, but I think, we can quickly go through the kind of shortened down, very cut down version of what was going on in those years, and why was it, this war actually happened. Why is it that the Russians are so insistent at trying to keep the Ukraine under their control, and what are the historical determinations for that, and why is this war so important, not just for Russians but for Europe, US, and to be honest, the rest of the world, because this war is a very influential. The results of this war can probably influence the policies of many countries for years to come, and the result of this war will influence the safety of my children, your children, our children's children, our great children's great children. So obviously, for many people it seems like a small conflict somewhere on the edge of Europe, in the countries which most of, the size of both of which are probably twice the size of the rest of Europe, but it does mean a lot, so it takes up a relatively small area, but it does influence millions of people as it stands at the moment. Millions of people have been influenced, but it's also influences the future of the world as a whole. And to understand the ideas behind all of this, obviously I'd like to go back in history, go to say 1500 years ago, as the Roman Empire was falling apart. Many new countries have started to appear. Italy, Germany, they all taking their back, starting back from that time. Also an area down in the east of Europe, like kind of closer to Asia, the area which is like many people did not consider very much. The cities start to appear in that land. Now, in those times, for example, the Vikings, after between 5th century and about 14th, even 15th century, people who were obviously Vikings, I think they didn't last that long, but between kind of those centuries, for example, Vikings called that part of Eastern Europe, they had a name for this, as far as I remember, that was called Gardarika. If there is anybody with a watch from this, they will, from obviously Northern Europe, who are probably going to be a bit more clued up on the languages. But as far as I understand, Gardarika meant the country of cities. So there's a lot of city-states which are starting to pop up around the Eastern Europe. So Kiev being one of the oldest and one of the most influential at the time. So the Kiev city is, I think, 1535 years this year, so it's kind of quite an old, big history. Obviously, it started from a small town because it wasn't such a very good crossing of trade routes. It meant that over time it became more influential and, started influencing more of the places around it. And at the time, the Eastern Europe was technically most of the time a democracy. So it meant that the citizens of the city would elect their leaders, not just in their trades or in their local districts, but the people who would come to be the rulers of the city, the princes of the city, they were actually invited in, or they would be somebody of the locals who would control a certain group of armed men, but they could have been given a kick. So people could have said, look, you know what, we asked you, we invited you to kind of be our military leader and, act on our behalf in the politics of the local cities, in the communications, but you're not doing a good enough job, so you may piss off. So obviously, it's kind of, it was very opposite to what was happening in Europe or in the Asia, where the cities were becoming more centralized, the governments were building up into the kind of kings and queens and stuff like this. But over time, the princes it's become like one of those things that the job would get passed on. But even then, when for example, Prince of Kiev died in so many hundred years, ago, he died and he had a couple of sons, when the two sons would say, okay, which one of us, we will fight between ourselves. But in the end of the day, it's quite often was the people who would say, well, actually, we like this guy more, so he gets to be the prince, and the other guy doesn't get much chances. So, take a break, if they were in good relationships, then it might be given like, look, there is another city just over there, and how about we kind of both run those cities? And you would go in there, the second one, the one that lost the election in the biggest city, would go to a smaller one, saying, okay, is it alright if I become your ruler now? Because you need a prince, you need somebody to run you, to do the military stuff, to be the representation stuff, and, I already have a brother in that big city. This makes us, puts us in a better position. So over time, it kind of became part democracy, part non-democracy. It's kind of getting a bit very confusing. But until about 10th century, at the start of the 10th century, the guy appears who's been called Yaroslav the Wise, who kind of, I think, was one of the few people, they made many attempts to unite these eastern lands. And they were still kind of going like, yeah, we don't like you guys over there, so we're kind of going to deal with our own laws. And one of the kind of, what happens is Yaroslav the Wise, he has a fight with his brother. And before he starts this fight, his name is Yaroslav the Lame, because apparently he had a problem with one of his feet, which he damaged when he was a kid. Now, this guy is a very key person to the history of the whole of Europe. I mean, not just Europe, but probably the world. Because about 100 years before Magna Carta, this guy has voluntarily, to win the support, popular support of the people, he does a very brilliant political move. What he does is he sets a set of laws, a constitution, like they used to have like in ancient Greece or like in like Rome maybe, but he sets up a constitution which clearly defines the rights and the responsibilities of people who live in the land, which clearly defines the kind of punishments for, like, for example, if somebody killed somebody, they might have to pay a fine to a family, or according to the old laws, they might have to actually become like a son to kind of move and become a member of this family to replace the member they killed. So, and it was all clearly defined in those laws. It was called Ruskaya Pravda, and at that time, it's the whole country's kind of around those times. The whole country, the whole Eastern Europe, gets the name of Kievan Rus. Now, why am I telling about this guy? Obviously, why it's so important overall in the later dates is because this guy also manages to marry his daughters off into nearly every royal house in Europe. He has like 8 or 10 daughters, and they become queens of England, France, Austria, Germany, like Spain. Whichever royal court there was probably a Ukrainian queen in there at the time. So, okay, just a little interesting fact, obviously, is the fact that most of the royals in the modern world will be Ukrainians, in a way. So, and again, it kind of plays, obviously, as you know, if you trace the history, it obviously plays a big role later. So, around that time, right, you know, Kiev is about 500 years old, it becomes the kind of central, becomes more central to that area, because a lot of trade routes like goes through Kiev. The Dnieper River trade route through the Black Sea to pick up the salt from the Crimea. The trade routes to Asia, you know, go through there. So there's quite a few trade routes that go through that city. So it becomes a very big and influential city. At the same time, at the east, there's Mongols are starting to rise slowly. You know, the China or Mongols Empire. Obviously, that will happen a couple of hundred years later, but about 100 years later, Moscow is being organized. I say Moscow is about 600 years, 650 years now, so I didn't check exactly, but something along those lines. So it's kind of a few hundred years later, Moscow is being organized. But as history goes on, you know, Moscow's organized, Mongols come in, you know, Mongols manage to quite heavily damage Kiev. Actually, there's few Mongol invasions into Kiev. At one point of time, they've burnt the city to the ground. Okay, so as Kiev's been rebuilt, the other cities get slightly more influence, but it's still called Kiev Rus. Now, for example, during those times, another big city which is famously known for being kind of an apple to fight for between Polish and Ukrainians, Lviv, was set up. I mean, it was kind of set up by one of the Kievan princes for his son. So he basically said, look, you know, here's the troops, here's the people, there's too many of us here, but there is this area over there which would make a good place for a city, and you can you can rule that city, you can organize it, so obviously you're going to be its ruler. The son's name was Lav, which is in Ukrainian or like old Slavic tongue, it means a lion, and Lviv means that it's a city of lion. So, you know, city that belongs to a lion, kind of in a way. So that's the history of that city. Obviously, you know, quite known in the later dates as one of the places where like, big universities were. More universities started, I think, like around 13th, 14th century. There's a university, an academy being built in Kiev, for example, which still exists, Kievo-Mogilянska Academia, Kiev-Mogilянsk Academy. So quite an old establishment, so like on par with Oxford and Cambridge. But unfortunately, probably not yet as good at teaching to the level of Oxford and Cambridge just yet. I think they're working on that after the Soviet Union changes, but I'm sure they'll catch up there because it is an establishment with big history. But over the years, obviously, the Moscow appears, and as Moscow appeared, you know, it's kind of appeared as a small kind of little village or kind of that grew in a town and then grew in a city, because again it was kind of in the middle of nowhere, but it was the place. Obviously, if people went from somewhere to somewhere, it ended up being on a trade route through a Volga river. And again, it was very hard to get to, so very hard to conquer because of the areas around it. But on the other hand, it was, if you did go through those roads, then obviously it was a good spot to stop. So it kind of starts to gain influence. But as Kiev gets invaded by Mongols, has to fight Mongols on one side, obviously the Teutonic Knights, I think, are starting to invade from Europe. I mean, at that time they obviously started fighting as well. They were fighting Turks, not Turks, but Muslims as well, which were coming in from the kind of African ways, like Middle East and Africa. Mongols were coming around them from the Far East, but the Mongol Empire becomes one of the biggest empires at the time, probably still the biggest now, at least biggest overland empire. And instead of fighting Mongols, what the Moscow princes do is they say to Mongols, look, you know what, how about we become your vassals? I'm not quite sure about the word, but basically they say, look, we're gonna be under you, so you be our rulers, we're gonna pay you some money every year, we're gonna collect taxes, just don't come and kill us. So instead of fighting them, they kind of say, look, let us rule these lands. And they get basically from the head of Mongolian tribes, they get this right to rule. And every new prince of Moscow had to go to to travel to Mongolia to confirm that, yes, I have the right to rule. And it wasn't done originally by them, it was done by a guy from Novgorod, but he did move to Moscow over time. And Moscow becomes this kind of center of the Mongolian controlled territory. Whereas on the south, from Moscow, kind of in what is more modern Ukraine, it becomes more of a kind of lots of fighting with Mongols. Then the Polish start to rise. Polish-Lithuanian Empire starts kind of not an empire as such, but quite a big state. Lithuania and Poland, they become first one state, then they fall apart. They try to obviously invade and capture Ukraine, and Ukraine becomes like a very kind of mix of different interests. But that culture of democracy kind of stays there. So, like, we're speaking about 15th century, like 14th, 15th century, where the more countries become centralized, like Moscow becomes what would later become Russia, gets centralized under the Moscow prince. The German Empire rises up, the Polish and Lithuania become like a big centralized state. Ukraine is a mix of forces. Polish are trying to invade, but the forces raised, which are like later become known as Cossacks, and they are more of a democracy. It's kind of a very weird mix which raises up in this area, because they have the cult of a warrior, which is like very similar to the way that in Japan, where many men would go in and, for example, live and train together, and women would be not allowed to go to move and live with the training men. So the men, if they want to have a woman, they have to kind of come train and then go see their woman outside. They obviously still get married and stuff, but so it's a warrior cult. But unlike in Japan, which is it's all about serving the master, the Ukrainian cult is more of a democracy. So it's all about serving the land. So the master can change, but the land stays. The Cossacks also start to become known around Europe as mercenaries. So they will pop up in history of many countries as the bodyguards to some kings, and Italian doges, for example, when they were fighting Turks and Almahans, they would be guarded quite often. They would hire some Cossacks to guard them, to French kings. One of the best known Cossacks, which is Ataman Sirko, at some point of time becomes a French national hero by a manager who manages to end the siege of one of the cities, which was a religious war in France, and he was the one who comes up with the plan and executes the plan of ending the siege. But at the same time as Ukraine becomes slowly grows into this more national democratic state, which is surprisingly for those days, because there wasn't many democracies in the world. There's very few democracies that could stand up, and at least try to hold their own against the bigger centralized countries over there. Because the Cossacks spent so much time as mercenaries, they were known as reasonably sturdy fighters, more inventive in their ways. And obviously quite often they had people come over and join them simply on those bases. And that's where the culture grows from. So it grows kind of slightly a bit from the democracy of the Kievan Rus, but it's slightly more is added to that. The Cossacks, they have this big cult of being warriors, and to the point where the Turks were that managed to invade all the way up to mid of Europe, Bulgaria. They had kind of nearly conquered Polish. The Polish ended up having to pay them the money. They were obviously the well-known legend of Count Dracula from Transylvania, which has been conquered by Turks, and then he turned apparently himself into a vampire to fight them. They come up from the further east. They reach out all the way all into kind of center of Eurasia kind of way, and they kind of manage, but kind of in Ukraine they kind of come a little crapper, because this is the land which is kind of hard to capture, very hard to say, well, look, you're the central leaders, so you're the ones who has to pay us, because obviously the leaders can be changed within by simply guys getting together and saying, look, you're not doing what the land needs, you're not doing what we need, we don't like you, go away. There was this thing where people used to get together on the square, which would be called Maidan, and apparently the word came actually from Turks to Ukrainian language. So okay, I'm not gonna argue about this, don't know, but it becomes people would get together in Maidans. So again, very probably not the word many of you probably heard when they heard about the Ukrainian Revolution in 2004 and 2013-14. The word Maidan, which means square where people would get together and decide together on certain decisions for what they need to do. So it was kind of local democracy, and then they would elect the local representatives to go and represent them into the other higher up situations, so all the way to representing themselves into running a country. And yet it will be growing up, so the representative would be elected for this mission and this mission only, or for few months only. So it wasn't something that was you'd elect someone for 20 years. No. It's just, every year, every time there was a gathering, everybody stood a chance of actually losing their position. So it wasn't that simple. But to get those decisions, what they did is they'd get into the square, and then they would have basically a screaming match. So whoever's the loudest, whoever's got the most people, they allow only to scream. They have to be allowed, but they cannot fight. So no fighting, just obviously becoming. And this is where the differences become with Russia, because in Russia it's a very centralized state. They do have some resemblance of democracy all the way until I think Peter the Great, who kind of said, look, don't really care about your democracy. I've been to Europe, they have no democracy, they're happy there without it, so should you be. And obviously the stories about Ivan the Terrible, but I'm not sure which city he's been in. So again, I know he existed, and I know he's been a very shrewd politician, but he was not the guy who could actually like single-handedly decide something. He did depend on the democratic election, and he could be kicked out of his place. It was Peter the Great, I think, that managed to completely seal in the fate of Russian throne as being something which can't be disputed. So yet it was quite a few times, but that's already a different history. And Peter the Great, as he was trying to build up the Russia, because at that point of time, obviously, many people, when they heard about Ukraine, they would go for the Polish version, which would say, yo, it's just the country on the edge. We don't, it's not big enough. It's only like same size as Poland and Lithuania put together. But, it's on the edge. It's not very heavily populated. So, it's alright. It's country on the edge. And it kind of was actually country on the edge, to be honest. It was country on the edge of European culture, which moved into Poland with Teutonic rights, which Polish fought. Then they kind of, obviously, this kind of European influx there, Far East influx from Mongols, and half kind of northern Far East influx from Russia, and then Turkish influx from the south. So it's kind of was sitting on the edge of every culture, so to say, which was very any influential culture that influenced Europe to such a level. Ukraine was pretty much sitting on the edge of it. So if I was to say that Polish were actually right, Ukraine was a country on the edge, but it kind of depends what kind of edge you pick. So at that time, Ukrainians have lots of crashes with Poles and Turks, to the point, because obviously the Polish trying to put their influence over the land, trying to move in and claim the land for their own. So there's lots of fighting happening there, different unions, different fighting. As a matter of fact, if the Polish were running slightly different policy when they were invading Ukraine, they might have actually had stood a very good chance of capturing the whole land and not have such a big pushback from the people that live there. But they didn't do it all quite right. So obviously, and again, if you look at the Polish history, it was again kind of a mix of monarchy and democracy. Kind of the king was reigning, half ruling, half not ruling. Was kind of again a very complicated mixture of things happening in Poland. And I'm sure there's plenty of Polish guys who can tell you a lot about their own history. And it's, again, if you're a historian, if you're interested in politics, in very complicated political systems, I think learning what was happening in Poland, to the way they were ruled and governed, is a very, very big subject. People would probably have to talk about it for hours. And you could probably write books and books and books about the way they've done things. That mixture of kind of wild democracy, it's with the monarchy. It's just been quite an interesting kind of set of subjects. But so we're going to go back to Ukraine. So at that time, Peter the Great kind of cements Russia as a pure monarchy, so there's no democracy at all. He cements the kind of situation, and he tries to put the Russia onto European stage. The Mongols by that time kind of fell apart, so they don't have that pressure from the east, and they become their own country. All of a sudden they have this big chunk of land which they govern and rule, but obviously this chunk of land, they want to be on plane, at least considered equal with the European counterparts, because obviously on the east it's a mess. The Mongolia fell apart and it just went to a tribal warfare. and the nearest big countries which were kind of reasonably influential were somewhere in China, like China, and then obviously Korea, Japan, but they were so far away from Russia back then. And then you have, like, right on the western border, there's a bunch of countries which are like, despite whatever people say, even the small Germany, German Empire, which was at that time kind of building up, German Austrian Empire, could probably annihilate Russia if they wanted to. It's just they were too busy fighting between themselves. And Russia tries to kind of move into the European, kind of theater. And that, I think, when Peter the Great has probably done one of the biggest mistakes the Russian governments ever did. He tries to claim that, he says, instead of saying, look, we're young, vibrant country, we're wanting to join, kind of this European theater, we're very interested in becoming part of this world. Yes, we're willing to grow, we're growing fast. And during his rule, Russia has actually achieved a fair bit, He did personally go around Europe, he did learn a few trades, he brought a few tradespeople, the tradesmen actual, like, people who would work with metals, wood, make ships, things like this. So instead of positioning his country as somebody new, vibrant, powerful, growing, and somebody who's not a threat to Europe but who's a friend of Europe, he decides to play, which is because at that time Russia was not actually called Russia, it was called Moscovia, after the capital. It's like the land of Moscow. And he decides to play on the old connection of Moscow to Kiev, because Moscow was part of Kievan Rus. And he says, look, we are the guys who taking over after them. But obviously, so he starts to try and claim the history which was happening in the territory which was not even part of Russia as part of their own, to give legitimacy to the Russian throne, to give legitimacy to Russia. He actually says, he actually picks the name Russia because that's how he saw one of the Italian travelers use this word when he was describing the lands of Kievan Rus. That was how it was spelled. That's how the name came to be. And I think overall he makes a mistake, because from that time he needs to have a control over Ukrainian territories, at least over Kiev. From that time on, to justify Russia's existence, to justify Russia's connection to Europe, the Russia needs to control that territory. And he goes to big lengths to do that. And they will finally manage to control full Ukrainian territories only somewhere in like 1600s, like after Catherine the Great, probably 1700s. I don't remember the dates. I usually say look at the trends and how things work, rather than whenever did they work, but they are in requirement to get this control over Ukraine, at least get that connection to Ukraine, because without that connection they're nobody. Obviously for that time they probably seemed like a good political move, because he could then claim, look, oh, you guys all have daughters of Yaroslav the Wise were married into you. There's some other Kievan guys, are princes that would actually marry their daughters, or have somebody marry them from Europe. So we have this relation, we have this connection. So it probably seemed like a good idea, but I think overall in the long run it became a very, very, very bad decision for Russia, because they have to control. To the point where, for example, I think at the start of the 20th century, Kaiser, the German Kaiser, said, look, Russia is an empire as long as it has Ukraine. If it doesn't have Ukraine, it's not an empire, it's just nobody. and they are forced with that stage. So they go to a long, big lengths to keep control of Ukrainian land, to the point that first they offered their assistance to Cossacks, which were by then becoming a state of their own, in their fight against Polish. They didn't do it quite nicely, but they did help Ukrainians to keep control of the eastern, of what is called Eastern Ukraine these days, so on the eastern side of the Dnieper River. They did get the support to do that, but then they make a deal with Polish saying, look, you know, we're not going to help Ukrainians to move any further. But he gets very close with one of the Ukrainian leaders. And yet, over time, you know, everybody says, look, all this Ukrainian leader wants is to get this western part of Ukraine and Ukraine as a separate state. So these are about the times when, like say, the Cossacks become quite known in Europe as mercenaries as well. So Cossacks are all over, and say one of them becomes a French national hero. But it takes Russians only until before, at that time obviously the Russians cannot completely destroy Cossacks, because Cossacks are also protecting them from Crimean Tatars and Turks. Now the Turks were called Cossacks. They had actually a name. Because there's a particular caste of warriors in the Cossacks' history, say legends, and those guys were called, the Turks called them Urus Shaitan, which is in Arabic means head of all evil, but in Turkish, because it's slightly different than Arabic, of the Turkish of that time, it was actually demons from Rus, and they were considered them just a force of nature. Look, you know, if we can catch them, we'll kill them, but these guys are like nutcases, you know. And there's been quite a few stories about Cossacks, I say, you know, a few legends, but obviously one of the things that Cossacks did is already during the time of Catherine, Cossacks were using missiles, like small missiles, like what we call fireworks now, as a weapon against enemy horse troops, yeah, so cavalry. So against enemy cavalry, they shoot missiles at them, scare living shit out of horses, so make the horse attack lose that speed, and obviously help to deal with them better, so as more protective. And they come up with the, like, you know, they say, look, you know, it's a great weapon, we like it, it's kind of, you know, easy for us to use, much better than having to build big cannons, which we can't carry with us, because there wasn't as much cavalry among Cossacks and not as many horses. So they obviously would have only small cannons, which would be used, but they said, look, we can use missiles for whatever we want. Brilliant, easier to build, they blow up, you know, and they come up with this great lie, which is quite entertaining, that the guys from that caste, the one which were called Charakternik, the guys from that caste could actually fly those missiles to the moon. And to say that how long that legend persisted, it was a few years later, those days, the guy called Jules Verne ended up traveling to Russia, and Russians were trying different missiles as a weapon, but obviously they did not become such a big thing until a lot later. But he hears this legend, but obviously at that time it was considered that the cannon is a more powerful thing. So in his book about the trip to the moon, he builds a very, very big cannon. Well, Ukrainians got to try more correct, and we fly to the moon with the missiles, with the rockets. So again, but Russia at that time manages to different political terms, and after the war in Crimea, where they managed to push Turks quite far away, without the need for Cossacks, they not quite honestly destroy the Cossacks, one of the main Cossack strongholds. They do not completely destroy Cossacks, they offer them a deal, which is, we will move you further east, we'll give you lands further east, as long as you protect us from the tribes that live to the east. And over time the Russian conquers continue conquering the eastern territories, which is like modern Chechnya, Abkhazia, Ossetia, Georgia, Armenia. They continue kind of pushing into that area. But obviously Cossacks are quite often the key element to what they were doing. And unfortunately, most of the Cossacks were destroyed during the revolution, and obviously during the Second World War. But I say, the Russians obviously captured them. Obviously there's a history of Soviet Union and things like this, but over all these years, the key trait for many Ukrainians was to gain independence. Actually, a quite known things, for example, I think it was 80s or 70s, when a Ukrainian ran out onto the football pitch where the Soviet team was playing with a Ukrainian flag and started dancing, which is a Ukrainian national dance called Habak. And he started dancing, and obviously the Ukrainians, we ended up being all over the world, and the whole struggle was to free Ukraine from Russia. At the same time, Russians could not let Ukraine go. Like I say, it took me 40 minutes to describe the whole history. I thought it was going to be faster. But Russians could not let Ukraine go because it would cancel their claim to an empire. Because their claim to have that part of history that was connected to Kiev, which they made during the times of Peter the Great, was coming back to bite them in the ass. They could not do that. So now we're coming through to, let's say, they use quite a few things to keep Ukraine in their area of kind of influence. So what happened? So we're coming back to slightly to a more modern history. So Soviet Union falls apart, and Ukraine becomes an independent state. And this big thing, this big legend, which is being peddled by Russian media. Look, Ukrainians and Russians were brothers who went through so many things together. And, overall, I'd probably say, yeah, we were brothers. At least people were, not the governments. The government's a bunch of assholes in Russia. So, but at least that's what many Ukrainians say. Look, we don't mind Russian people, just your governments are slightly not all there, We don't really like them. We're quite happy with going back to more democracy. Maybe it's a mess, we're not doing it exactly right, but this is where we want to go. And ever since from the 90s, when the Soviet Union fell apart, Ukrainian slowly moves away from the Soviet kind of paradigm, from the Russian Empire paradigm of big leader and nobody else matters. If you go to Ukraine now, there's on local levels at least, it's way more democratic than it is in Russia. But I say over time, obviously, Ukrainians started moving more towards Europe. 2004 revolution, where they were tried to put the Yanukovych, which was being kicked out in 2014, put him in power. But obviously, people say, look, we don't want a criminal over here, So it was kind of a bit of a tussle. It was very peaceful, which was very nice, nobody got hurt. And they managed to push him away. So obviously, first steps into Europe back then, as well, one of the decisions which was taken by Ukrainian government, and kind of proud of having taken part in that decision, which was one of the people who kind of talked to one of the two people in the government in the actual parliamentary commission on tourism. There was a push for introduce the visa-free travel for Europeans. So those demands coming from all sides, say, look, let people in, let them come and see Ukraine the way it is, don't try to make lots of money. And at this time, 2005, I was actually lucky enough to visit Ukrainian parliament and actually speak to one of the guys from that particular commission. And again, the talk came to this visa-less travel. We talked about it. I was quite young, and he just wanted to know the opinion of somebody younger who was living abroad, so why would, whether it be a good idea or not. And I think all people put together, obviously, the Ukrainian allows Europeans in. So Ukraine starts to see more Europeans, especially the western side of Ukraine, which makes it strive for Europe more, because they see that Europe is not perfect. Look, there's plenty of problems in Europe, but compared to Russia, it's obviously doing a lot better, which is a bit harder for people in the eastern Ukraine, because the younger generation, which has access to internet and things like this, they're more open to that. But the older generation, which generally relies on mostly Russian channels, which at that time already started going into full mode, just Europe is bad, they have 82 types of gays and lesbians, and they have this and they have that, and they're gonna come in and they're gonna take your babies and give them to immigrants to raise because they just love immigrants and stuff. It's the kind of shit that's been coming there. So people kind of start to fall apart into, but the more younger generation still kind of moves towards Europe. So in 2013, by that time Yanukovych managed to win the election yet again. He actually won it fair and square. Maybe not quite fair and square, but he did win it. And he actually won it because he was started pushing for Europe as well, because a lot of forces in his own environment started saying, look, you know what, we're getting better deals from Europe than we get from Russia. Russia is trying to bring us down, and obviously if we want to keep our billions or millions or hundreds of thousands of income every month, a year, depending on whichever level they were, we are more interested in getting to the place where there are certain rules, the rules we can walk by, rather than going to the economy in Russia, of connecting too close to Russia, which don't follow any rules except whatever the fuck they want to do. So if they come here, they're going to be destroying us. But he goes there and is more pushed towards the, obviously, moving into Europe. And Yanukovych also becomes he starts taking example from the way Putin does things in his country, which is, I'm the king, you guys are nobody, whatever I say goes. But there's one issue he did not consider, is Ukraine is a lot smaller than Russia. There is more influence it gets from younger generation, and the younger generation is more open to Europe, but it's also younger generation is more active. So when he goes to Russia, he also gets into this problem, which is many people think he has been threatened by Russians, saying, look, if you do go to European Union, which he was about to sign a treaty, if you do go to European Union, we will invade Ukraine, so we will stop you whichever way necessary. So again, that decision backed by Peter the Great, comes back to haunt Russians. They cannot claim to be this big force without having the connection to Kiev. They cannot let Kiev go. Whereas the Ukrainian people say, look, you know what, we're interested to go in with those who are actually producing something good, where we can take an example from and learn and become better and, stronger, and build a country where the roads don't fall apart every bloody month, not a month, but every year they have to build a new road somewhere, and the paint gets off the roads, and quite a few teasing problems. I say, look, we want to go to the places where they're solving these problems, not to the place where these problems have been just exaggerated to enormous amounts, and as long as the government can steal, everybody's happy. So, and obviously, obviously many people who are from Europe, they're probably going to say, oh, he just doesn't like Russia, but seriously, guys, just, if you love Russia so much, why don't you go to Russia and spend a year living there? If you have your Russian friends, many will probably agree that, look, once you go outside Moscow, the roads are quite often non-existent, even in the bigger cities, the roads are starting to fall apart, every year. There's like, quite a few problems, and the problems with the medical care is like, as you have never seen, people complaining about NHS in England. I have a friend who's actually lives in Russia, but she's thinking about coming back to England because she lived here since she was a kid. And she went there and she said, and she will prove to you, look, if you're complaining to NHS, try spending 3 months in Russia. You're gonna love NHS. NHS is brilliant, and it truly is in many ways. Yes, it's been quite crippled in the last few years. Hopefully they'll be able to rebuild it after whatever has been done to it. But NHS is still way more brilliant. Even medical, me being from Ukraine, I can quite happily say to you guys, I've been to Ukraine often enough, even though I wasn't there the last couple of years, but I've been often enough. I still kept in touch with a few people, and they will confirm that the medical care in there is the government. There's no real free medical care. Even if you go to a free hospital, you still have to pay. You have to buy your medicines. You have to, if you have to have a film taken of your broken arm, you still have to buy the film for the machine that takes that picture. So you still have to pay for everything. You don't have that in UK. So UK is quite good, maybe not as good as we would like it to be. There's a few things we can all complain about. I did just recently, but that's what you buy. But they don't even have that in Ukraine. And it's not the fault of doctors, it's the fault of the governments. And Ukrainians said that, look, we want to go there. When Yanukovych went to Russia, people suspect he was threatened by an invasion, so he pedals back on the agreement with Europe. Right, so he kind of afraid of the force. But what happens is a lot of youngsters go out in 2013, September, October. They go out in 2013 and they start protests saying, look, we want to go to Europe. You're fucking with our future, okay? We don't want to let you fuck our future up. We need to make those agreements. We're gonna be here until you do. But over time, obviously, the protests, especially closer to the winter, closer to the new year, the protests are starting to die down. People just say, look, obviously, we're not getting in anybody's way, and they were not, Yet, nobody knows why. It was an insane decision by the Ukrainian government, and obviously they decide to attack these protests, right? Many people obviously and this what results in what was called a revolution of dignity, because the police that attacked the protests, they beat up boys, girls, like they were all students, like 16 to 19 to 20, there wasn't anybody that dangerous there. They were not like, hardcore killers in there. The police just came in there swinging, and then we get a revolution of dignity, because quite a big part of the country gets up and says, look, that's not how you deal with children, okay? That's not how you do it. You do not behave like this. And people refuse to leave. The police tries everything they can. And overall, it became it wasn't like just a matter of like fighting, but it was a very symbolic. For example, there's a good example that's been given for me by someone else. Just sort of say, for example, people were fighting on one street, and somebody asked them, look, why don't you go through a few blocks, go around, and come down to the government building through a different street? There's only like 3 policemen sitting on that street. They say, look, it's not just about the fighting the police. It's about the symbol that we are owners on our own land. If we go around, if we go through the back entry, This means we come in as thieves, but we're not. We're going straight through, and they're not stopping us. This is our country. They do not have that much influence. And that happened. The thing is what I said, this is where the people in the government misunderstood Ukraine and Russia. Because Ukraine is, despite its second biggest country in Europe after Russia, it's still reasonably small. So when the attack on the youngsters happened, overnight, many people heard about it, and then next day people were already arriving into Kiev to support those protests. And they were not about Europe anymore. They were, say, European parts still stayed, but they were about people saying, look, this is not how we do it. We are a civilized country, and we cannot just send in your goons, even if they're part of the police force, to just beat up kids. If there was somebody causing trouble, then arrest the people who cause trouble. But you don't come in beating up girls, beating up just young guys who are trying to stop you from putting a army boot onto a girl's head. You cannot just run in, and everybody, there was a video where some people, they were running. The guy was already knocked out on the ground, and every police officer running past him felt it was a good idea to just run in and kick him or punch him or hit him with the bat. People said, look, this is not how we do things. This is not our way. And obviously, this went to the Revolution of Dignity, which is obviously over time, they continued escalating the violence until the point where they started shooting at people from rifles and machine guns. Up over 100 dead during that revolution, which were just people, simple people who would not back down. And after 100 those people died, and the crowd has started saying, look, you know what, if it happens again, we're gonna come after you with shotguns and guns. There's plenty of people in there that went through war, people who came through Afghanistan, people who took part in the peace, army peace kind of troops going through different peace operations through UN. So there's been plenty of people who could do the serious damage should they decide to go armed. And when they started saying, look, you know what, we are gonna go and we're gonna kill them now, and they were held back by one of the people who's done it was the current president of Ukraine, but there's a few other politicians said, look, give us some time, because obviously, this is, if we're gonna go this way, it's not gonna go right. They've been held back. And they didn't, but obviously the government at the time had to give in. They have to say, look, we're going to have new elections, we're going to have this. And this is when Yanukovych runs off. He just picks up his money because he understands people aren't going to let him kind of just keep everything. He grabs as much money as he can, and he runs. Apparently he had a whole truckload of stuff, which is including cash and gold stuff, and they still found a gold toilet or a gold loaf of bread, which was made especially for him, which weighed a kilogram. So there's quite a few things, he runs off, and obviously this is where the Revolution of Dignity ends. But obviously Ukraine makes its choice. It goes to Europe, and this is what the Russians cannot allow. So there is a part of European law which very few people know, but it says that if there is a war or civil unrest in the country, so there is a civil war in the country, especially civil war, the country would not be allowed to join Europe. Not to join Europe, but to sign even association agreement. So the country will not be allowed. So the Russians use the local gangs and a few of the politicians and the police officers they just paid them money to invade Crimea. But at that time, maybe not the wisest move, but at least the most peaceful move which has been done by Ukrainian government, was to say to the troops which are based in Crimea, do not fight Russians, just don't. Okay, obviously there were some troops which decided to go to the side of Russians, but a few troops which did end up moving out of Crimea to Ukraine with their families, and they got an order, do not fight Russians. We're gonna try and deal with that peacefully. So obviously, we don't want the fighting, we don't want any bloodshed. And at that point of time, the Russia and Ukraine are technically at war. Even though war was proclaimed, Russians just said, look, no, we're not. Crimea is going to be democratically moved to Russia. And they organized a referendum in less than a week to have a Crimea democratically be moved from Ukraine to Russia. Obviously, we can understand how well it was organized, and you see most of the people just did not believe that referendum, although there was a lot of people in Crimea who might have wanted to join Russia. They might have truly wanted it. They're just people, normal people, and who thought that Russia was their big brother. They were also very scared because the Russian propaganda started going there saying, look, Ukrainians are gonna kill you all. They just, hate you speaking Russian. It was like, for which many Ukrainians said, well, what do you mean? We lived with them in the same country for 20 odd years. Nobody killed anyone. We just went there for a holiday. We didn't mind them talking Russian to us. As long as they didn't mind us talking bad Russian back to them, or Ukrainian. Many people in Crimea spoke Ukrainian, actually. I mean, a friend of mine, who's a friend of mine still, despite the fact that we only kind of talk on Facebook once in a while, but he was from Crimea, and he said that he understood Ukrainian by simply watching Ukrainian TV. It's a young guy, so there's plenty of youngsters there who spoke perfectly good Ukrainian. Was no problems there, but the Russian propaganda kept on, pushing, and especially the older generation, the ones that are not too savvy with the internet, they got under the influence of Russian propaganda saying they're gonna come and kill us. It was like, okay, But nobody wanted a bloodshed from Ukraine, and Russians invaded Ukraine. As there was no bloodshed in Crimea, the Russians sent their troops and their trained insurgent groups into a number of cities in the east and south of Ukraine. So my home city, Kherson, okay, those guys got killed off and buried somewhere on the floor of the Dnieper River, or somewhere in the islands, I don't know, probably somewhere in the fields, probably not all in the same place and not all the parts in the same place, but those guys got done with. But the guys in the east of Ukraine, so in Donetsk and Lugansk, they actually managed to get a foothold in there, and they've been supported by local criminal gangs, which was supported by people who were supporting President Yanukovych and corrupt officials. They got paid quite a bit. So Russian invasion in Ukraine has started, and overall it's been like a slow-going war because they thought that Ukrainians will not be able to fight back, and it will be like a week-long operation. But the Ukrainians did fight back. As a matter of fact, the Russian troops with the insurgency groups and stuff like this, they were stopped by by militia, basically. People who volunteered into that militia. They organized against the government orders and started fighting those insurgent groups, and they were the ones who did not allow them to continue the advance. They were the ones who stopped the Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers. There was not that many there, but there were a few. And they were the ones who stood in their way while having just machine guns and a few grenades, or submachine guns or assault rifles, but they did not have any heavy artillery and stuff like this. And by that time, Ukrainian army starts to kind of get involved as well, because obviously that's already something which bloodshed has been already started by the Russian invading force. And so the war starts to get into a hotter stage, and yet in Europe many people don't know about it. Why is that? Well, because overall this is one of the most important wars which are happening in the world right now. And why is that? Well, in 1996, I believe, there was an agreement, a memorandum, under which the Ukraine has given up all of its nuclear weapons to the rest of the world. So like Europe, Russians, Americans, the weapons were dismantled. Ukraine at that time had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world after Soviet Union, and they gave it all up for one simple thing. They were guaranteed that if Ukraine is invaded, then the countries like Russia, US, UK, later France, would guarantee that Ukraine would get the necessary assistance and their borders will be protected. So why is this war so important to Europe? Well, number one, as I say, the nuclear proliferation treaties. Right? If Ukraine gives up right now, for example, and says, look, we cannot fight Russians, we give up, our allies have screwed us, this memorandum has not been honored, what do you think happens next? How many countries have been persuaded not to start a nuclear armament program by simply getting guarantees from UN or other big countries that if they don't do this, that they will not be invaded? And yet now there's quite a few countries around Russia which are probably thinking, what the fuck, these motherfuckers can come in here, they can do whatever they want, they will not listen to anyone, and nobody's going to do nothing. So basically, like that. Or let's say, like somebody lives, like Iran and India, for example, and they decide to have their nuclear fight because, well, nobody does nothing. So they will continue growing their nuclear arsenal. Iran just been recently persuaded to stop their nuclear program. Well, they were persuaded under the guarantees that Iran stays Iran, no matter what. We can have whatever disagreements we want, but we will not let your country be invaded by other countries. Well, right now those guarantees are kind of under a big question, because anything happens to Ukraine, these economic sanctions, they're not kind of stopping the Russia. Russia could probably still send in the troops. Now, the problem that Russia has at the moment is they lost their moment, because the Ukrainian army was not prepared to defend them if they attacked at force, for example, in the beginning of 2014. If they attacked at force, they had a strong chance of capturing a big chunk of Ukraine, much bigger than they have at the moment. Of course, to do that, they would have had to take the troops from every border they have, but they had a chance. Like one big strike, get as far as you can, capture as much land as you can, and then send the troop back, obviously, to their locations. So they had a chance. But at the moment, Ukraine has managed to not rebuild its army, but at least bring it back up to the level where if the Russians invade, well, they're in deep shit. The army is not enough to attack, but through the history of Ukraine never really captured lands by invading anybody. The lands that came to Ukraine, they came there themselves. They wanted to be part of Ukraine. So it's just, they just wanted to be part of that culture. The Russians, the Ukrainian army is not strong enough to go in and, for example, start capturing lands in Russia. But to be honest, Ukrainians don't really want it. They just want Russians out. Just get out, stay in your Russia, if you love your president Putin, go suck his cock, whatever. There's plenty of people in Europe who apparently want to suck his cock, so, why would Russians not want to suck his cock, If people want to suck his cock, fuck off. Fine, just go to Russia. I'm sure he'll be happy to allow you. Right? But on the other hand, Ukrainians just want them out, just out. And this is where you say the US kind of and UK are sitting on a kind of very slow nuclear time bomb, because if they don't protect Ukraine, every country which had frozen their nuclear program will start it again, because nobody feels safe again. So the war in Ukraine is very important from that point of time. If they do it wrong, if Ukraine becomes invaded by Russia, and the actions of US and UK and France, and to be honest the rest of Europe, do not help Ukraine to defeat that invasion, do not help to keep Ukraine within its borders, even if it's just the Crimea which is taken. If they manage to kick them out from the east of Ukraine, but the Crimea is not returned to Ukraine, then we're sitting on a nuclear time bomb, because more and more countries will go like, yeah, but what happens if somebody invades us and they have the nuclear weapon and we don't? What does the wall do? The wall does nothing. They just allow them to keep the chunk they want. That's not good. That is not good, because I don't want my children, whenever I have them, to be sitting on the nuclear bomb, which has been started by a raving fucking lunatic. Okay, I know I'm trying to keep it civil, but seriously, I don't want my children or my children's children to be sitting on that nuclear bomb, growing up thinking, okay, you know what, who's going to be the next guy who builds the bomb? Who's going to be the next guy who loses that bomb? Who's going to be the next guy who allows this bomb to fall in the hands of terrorists? Will it be the bomb that blows up in London, or will it be the one that blows up in Kiev or New York? Well, will it be the one that blows up in, I don't know, Istanbul, just because somebody doesn't like the new Turkish president? Or will it be the one that blows up somewhere in Africa, because Muslims, the Islamists decide that Christians are not good enough to live in Africa anymore, or whether it's because the African Christians finally decide to fight back. I want to be sitting there waiting for that. Seriously, guys, one of the most important reasons why the Ukraine cannot be allowed to fall by any reasonable European government, and this is why Europe does so much to impress the importance of better economy, in Ukraine, why they recently allowed Ukrainians to travel to Europe without visas. Again, same kind of thing. If Ukrainians go to Europe, more Ukrainians can go to Europe. It's becoming reasonably cheap. The wages in Ukraine, obviously not the best ones, but people can still afford a weekend in Germany, for example, with Airbnb and, cheap hostels, more and more youngsters can afford to spend, like 100 euros once a year to spend a weekend in Germany. Obviously, it's not a perfect deal, but, they can do this. And then they come and they can learn about Europe. And the more of them learn about Europe, the more of them will want to become part of Europe. And there will be more pressure on Ukrainian politicians to make Ukraine a European country. Not just in words, but like in level of income, the quality of life, something which we in England started to lose quite a bit lately. In many things like this. So this is a very important for people. But there is one more thing, let's put the big issue of nuclear armaments, which is, so many of us want to get rid of. Let's put it in different terms. Ukrainian population is 40 million people. At this point of time, the Russian invasion into Ukraine had millions of people, over 1 million people, that were moved from their places of life. So at this point of time, about 100 or 200 or 1,000 decided to run away into Russia. We're not very impressed by that from what I've heard. But over 1 million people have been moved and resettled in Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is over 40 million people, okay? So if you have a full-out invasion, a full-out war in Ukraine, and Ukrainians decide to move out of the country, like they did, in Syria, for example, instead of fighting the regime, they just, ran away, and can't blame them. If there's so many refugees coming from Ukraine, they are just on the border of Europe. Europe struggles with 1 million refugees from Syria. What will Europe do with 40 million people which only have to cross the border? Yes, not all of them will do this. Some of them will not be able to. Some of them will be saying, I'm too old, I'm just staying home. So let's say not 40 million, let's say 20 million people that can, just all they need to do is literally cross the border with Poland. Will the Europeans be able to start shooting at other Europeans that are running away from an invasion by a raving lunatic? Okay, the guy who has been stuck in a trap which has been set to him in the 16th century by a mistake of judgment of one person. The person who probably wanted the best for his country but ended up living a mess. Is this what we want? Is this the part of Europe we want? Because this is where we're going to end up. Okay? Leave aside, let's say, the nuclear threat of this whole thing. The economical impact of this is huge. Obviously, do we want another world war on our hands? Another person invading Europe? Because what happens to Belarus, which is not part of Russia, but again will be under threat of invasion? What will happen to Latvia, Lithuania, Poland? Is this the countries you want to have, the risks of invasion into them? How many millions of people will have to move out of these countries if the war starts? Is this war we want? Again, this is why I'm saying this is the most important war in Europe at the moment. Well, there's a few wars around the world, but to be honest, if we think about the influence on Europe, the war in Ukraine is by far more important than anything that happens outside. Like Syria, with as much as people's lives matter there, is a very important thing, but Syria is a result of war in Ukraine. The Russian influence, the Russian going to Syria, is an attempt to distract the attention from Europeans by creating a full-out crisis, humanitarian crisis in Syria, by bombing and leaving a daylight out of Aleppo and a few other cities, by creating millions of refugees. By doing this, they're trying to distract the attention from the war which happens right on the doorsteps of Europe. The war which most of the Europeans have not paid attention to. Say, in here I try to describe the history why it happened. Obviously, I understand it's long-winded, probably not a full-on historian explanation. It's just explaining the flow of things. But at this point of time, the choice the Europeans have to do is, are they fighting Russia the way they should fight it, like on every front? Or are they just kind of trying to continue ignoring the war which is raging on their doorstep? Because every Ukrainian soldier that dies in this war is the European soldier which is saved by not fighting it. Okay, but say the support from Europe should very paramount. And Europe is saying by allowing the Ukrainians to travel, by understanding that Ukraine is being invaded by Russians, that it's not a civil war there. By far not. It's like, people have seen pictures already all over the world. There's been a few groups that have proved that there's Russian military troops are in Ukraine by simply using the facts they found on public media, like pictures of T-72s, which were never used in Ukraine, by pictures of modernized T-80s as well, which were not armed in Ukraine armed forces so far. By finding how the Buk missile that hit the Boeing flight from Europe to Asia, how it traveled. So all that has been found through open media, by some footwork on the spot as well, So the Russian troops are there, and by recognizing that that is part of the Europe, by recognizing that Ukraine is part of Europe, and recognizing the importance of this war, first and foremost, Europe can do a lot by not trying to play this kind of agreement with the way that they did with Hitler. Look, we brought you years of peace. No, you don't. You don't bring years of peace with a lunatic. You bring the lunatic down. You fight him on every front before he becomes very dangerous and uncontrolled by thinking that he will be allowed to get away with anything he wants. At this point of time, the war with Ukraine has the influence of what the war of Poland was against Germany had. Should the Germans been stopped when they invaded Poland, there would be no Second World War. Unless Russians are stopped right now in a very strong manner. Say not just by arms, say we're not talking about force of arms, but through other means as well, by helping Ukraine become, let's be honest, a better place, by providing them with that necessary military backing, which is, I think, being done by Americans now. This is what needs to be done, and I understand that many people in here think, look, this is not the war we want to fight, but don't fight the war. Give the people who are already fighting it the tools to do so. And that's my point of this. And this war, like I said, is by far way more important than anything that happens in Syria. Even though the lives of people, helping the people living that are trying to evade Syrian war, is also has its role to play, because by fighting them in Syria, by saying them, look, we will push you back, we will help the people. Again, Europe saves itself from having to fight the war through their soldiers on their own land and through risking a nuclear conflict. So I think by far at this point of time, I've said most of everything I wanted. Again, it's been quite a long-winded talk, and I didn't think that the history part is going to take so much. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. If I have like a bunch of questions which I can then build upon, I will make another program, answer any questions you have. At this point of time, I say thank you to everyone who watches this video. I'll be grateful for any questions, any support, or anything else like this. I will also put this video on the YouTube channel. Thank you very much. Goodbye.